And we are live with the one and only Dr. Sean Olive. I want to give a big thanks to Sean Olive for joining us. For anybody who's unaware, Sean Olive is part of Harman International. Actually, why don't you introduce yourself
Sure.
and your roles? Yeah.
I'm with Harman International. I'm the senior fellow of acoustic research. I work in a corporate group called Harman X, or Intelligent Audio, I guess is the correct up name. And we do research mostly focused on acoustics, but that includes headphones, loudspeakers, uh, algorithms, spatial processing, and I've been at the job for about 28 years now. Prior to that, I worked at the National Research Council in Canada. I was a scientist doing research with Floyd Toole, who anyone in audio probably knows that name.
Yeah. So I get some comments here saying that the audio is a bit low. I'm going to see if I can turn that up. Maybe I can do this.
Ah, I can
Yeah.
move my microphone.
Yeah. We also have Blaine Lacrosse here.
Hello.
Many of you guys know him as Mad Economist in a number of different communities. So big thanks to Blaine. Blaine has been very influential for a number of us reviewers and sort of helping us avoid putting our feet in our mouths collectively.
Well,
and
sometimes.
correcting that when we do. So he's been very, very
Sometimes.
helpful. Yeah.
And
I
I appreciate the opportunity. I've been a massive fan of Dr. Olive for basically the entire time I've been in audio, so it's really an honor to be on with you.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome. So I figured what we would do in this live stream is we would cover a number of topics that just, I guess, Blaine and I, of course, have had lots of questions for Sean, and so this is a great opportunity. But then also we figured at the end, if there's time, we would do a Q&A session with the viewers and pick some questions. Guys, for all of your questions, hold them until the end, and we will try and cover them then. And also let us know if the audio levels still need to be adjusted a little bit, but I think we did some adjustments, so hopefully it should be good. Without further ado, let's get into it. So I wanted to begin by asking if Sean could give a brief overview of the Harman research in headphones. And I don't mean like the harmonic distortion stuff, but the stuff that's led to the Harman target, and also ask why listener preference is such an important anchor to use instead of something like the other targets like diffuse field and like even moving on from the in-room listening target. But yeah, why don't we start there with a brief overview?
Yeah, well, it's tough to be brief, but as I think we published 19 papers in total. So, but I'll try to be brief. So yeah, we started this topic back in 2012, and at the time there was a standard called diffuse field standard, where it's defined as you measure the headphone this way, and the notion behind it is that the headphone that we listen in diffuse sound fields. The ideal target curve is an average of all the sound sources, all the HRTFs averaged together, so that there's no sense of direction when you listen to your headphone. And so we started to measure headphones and design listening tests, and we found that this diffuse field target didn't sound very balanced. So it sounded a bit thin, a bit bright when we were listening to stereo recordings. So we started to measure headphones, and we came up with this theory that 99% of all stereo recordings, are made in studios through loudspeakers and listening rooms. So that for these recordings to sound good, you want to mimic the steady state response in a room of an accurate loudspeaker. When I say accurate, I mean anechoically flat on axis, smooth off axis. And it's been put in a fairly well damped listening room with reflections. And you measure at the eardrum what the super smooth frequency response would be at the eardrum. And that was the basis where we started. We started to compare that target curve to different headphones as well as the current diffuse field standard. And listeners were telling us that they thought this sounded more balanced. These were trained listeners. They said it sounded more balanced. They preferred the sound. We tested it against 30 odd headphones, and then we did a very large study involving over 200 listeners. And the results were pretty consistent, whether people were trained or untrained. They generally preferred this sound, this target. It went through we did some research where people could adjust the bass up and down as well as the treble. And we found that there were some variations in what people preferred in terms of bass. And so there's no such thing as a target that everyone will like. But we found that 64% of the people that we tested liked this target, and there was a smaller percentage of people that liked a little more bass, 2 to 4 dB more bass, and then there was and that was about 15% of the population we tested, and then there was 25% of the population liked the Harman target with slightly less bass. So to sum it up, that's what our research found.
Right, and these days, the Harman target, or a version of the Harman target, has become somewhat ubiquitous for reviewers who are measuring headphones. It's what we use as well, and so it's probably it's definitely the most common reference target there for headphone evaluations. But one of the things that I loved about, I should probably kind of back up a little bit and mention how it was that I came to bother to learn more about the Harman research. And it actually started from a place of thinking, reading the article from Tyle years ago when he first started covering that, Tyle Hertzens from Interfidelity. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking to myself, this preference research stuff, there's got to be more to it than just preference, because I had I suppose what I'd call the I know better complex, right? Like thinking what is it about, why is it that let's say we want to anchor our reference target to the preferences of, let's say, the unwashed masses who might not know necessarily what good sound is and whatever. And then I bothered to actually read the research, and I kept finding myself constantly defending it and trying to explain it a little bit more. And can you guys hear me? Is it too quiet? I see someone asking about the microphone level. Hopefully it's loud enough. But yeah, so I guess the question I would have is both when it comes to the relationship between the research that was done and for headphones and in connection with loudspeakers as well. After having just finished, rereading some of the research again, what was the reason that you guys decided that preference was so important, and that just listener preference? Was this in part because of the talking with Floyd Toole about the circle of confusion and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. Behind the headphone research was 30 years or more of loudspeaker research that began with Floyd Toole back in the 1980s at the National Research Council. And as a student, I went to visit his lab, 1984, and he was measuring fidelity. So he had people go in, do double-blind comparisons between speakers, and they would rate the naturalness, the overall fidelity. So he wasn't measuring preference at all. And what we found was that if you threw in an anchor, if you have a 10-point scale and you throw in a 5, it would naturally, the 5 was a pretty bad speaker. I remember it was I won't say what it was, but it was.
Oh, come on.
It was a dual concentric tannoy, so it was a large 8-inch woofer with a tweeter in the center, which is dual concentrics, and it just sounded like a megaphone. It was horrible, and as soon as you heard that speaker, everything else was higher than that. So you're automatically cutting off half the scale. So all the loudspeaker ratings would be very tight and close together, and you couldn't get any resolution. So the idea was let's have preference, and we'll define the relative magnitude of preferences. So if you have a strong preference over two speakers, you would rate it at least 2 points apart. A moderate preference would be 1 point, and a slight preference would be half a point. So that automatically increased the resolution of the scale by throwing out this really bad anchor. And I mean, we should have probably defined that anchor as a 3 or a 2. That would have helped. But nonetheless, we started using preference. And it turned out that the fidelity ratings and the preference ratings were highly correlated. So, and then if you measured the loudspeakers, the ones that were the most linear at the flattest frequency response, the absence of resonances, smooth off axis, got not only the highest fidelity ratings, but the highest preference. So basically preference is highly correlated with fidelity, and it's highly correlated with the objective measurements that tell us the linear frequency response, low distortions is very important. So I think preference, this notion that preference is different than fidelity, and this term accuracy, I think they're all highly correlated.
Right, and the research, as you're saying, it sort of validates that.
Yeah, and so the notion of deriving a Harman headphone target based on an accurate loudspeaker, I mean, I think there's that's the basis of the Harman target. Let's start with an accurate loudspeaker. We have 30 years of research to back it up that most people like this, and that's kind of the beauty of it. We didn't start from ground zero.
Right. I think that's actually one of the misconceptions that people seem to have about preference research in general. That there's this, I see it often that they'll cite the number that I think it was 249 listeners in the 2015 study. Mm-hmm. And then 64%, and with the thought that this target was derived just based on the average of what those people's preferences were, leaving aside the fact that it was anchored to an in-room listening target in the first place, and that there were two bass and treble adjustments is what we're talking about here, below 100 hertz with the shelf, and then the 2.5K up. I wanted to, we can get into that in a second, but I wanted to briefly ask before that, when you were first kind of setting out to do this research, was there anything that sort of surprised you as far as the results were concerned?
Well, I mean, I set out, we set out because this was a team effort, but I was frustrated by the lack of measurements, and if you looked in the literature, there was a lot of disagreement. So it surprised me. I guess I was a little surprised that people would generally agree on what was a good headphone. I mean, I thought they would. That was the hypothesis, but the fact that they would agree and you could predict it with a measurement just seemed too good to be true. But when you look at the loudspeaker research, it completely backs that up and confirms it. So
right.
So anyways, I was surprised, pleasantly surprised.
But... Right. I think one of the things for me was finding that I'd often thought that maybe the preference for a particular bass shelf, whether it was in IEMs, I thought this more with the in-ear headphones than over-ears, but even to a certain extent with over-ears, that I thought maybe that the preference for, extra bass was in some ways because listeners were trying to compensate, or had some other reason for wanting more bass. And that if they were listening to speakers, they wouldn't necessarily want this. But what the research shows is actually the opposite, is that they actually did prefer, more bass down there as well. So that was interesting.
And more bass on speakers specifically than on headphones.
Yeah, exactly, like with the HD100 in the 2013.
And also in McMullen's 2017 paper.
Right. The bass and loudness, yeah. So that, I mean, and there's lots of other stuff that's obviously surprising as well. But one of the things that you touched on, Sean, that I love about the research is that so many of the studies sort of confirm and validate one another. So it's almost like they're just different pieces to a puzzle, that when you kind of, the more of it that you sort of ingest, the more it comes together and it starts to make more sense, and then eventually you have this more complete picture. So I really like that. I guess the next topic that we could go over is what your sense is of the general reception that the Harman research has had in the public, because this body of research is public, whether you've seen resistance to the idea of this reference target.
Yeah, I mean, I think initially there was probably a lot of skepticism, but there was also some positive response, as witnessed by some of, the fact that you've adopted it as sort of a benchmark when you review headphones. Audio Science Review have adopted it as a benchmark. So, and ratings or artings.com have adopted it. So I think people are happy to see some science being finally applied to headphone evaluation, and I think reviewers in general are happy to have some guidance. It gives them some, makes their judgments more reliable. It gives you kind of an honesty truth check. So if you're a reviewer and you're going out and buying headphones and listening to them, you can always check your evaluations by looking at how well it complies with this. And if you're completely out to lunch, then that's kind of a red flag. So, but there's also some, as you might expect, some strong resistance, and it's I've had all kinds of people argue this and that. There's some very strong dissenters. So
they might be in group one of the other groups there, not group one, the Harman target lovers.
Yeah. So and I can understand, because to have some science published and that goes against your beliefs, this is always a problem when something challenges what you thought to be true without it, objectively validating it. So
yeah, one of the things that I've seen a lot is one of two things is probably the most common source of resistance, at least from anecdotally. For me, and it's been when somebody owns a headphone and they see that it doesn't match or it deviates in one area or another, but they happen to really like that headphone, right? And it might be because they haven't had that broad of experience with a wide range of headphones, or they haven't heard a headphone that does adhere to the target. That seems to be one source. So purchase justification seems to be one source of resistance or skepticism. The other source, I imagine, might come from people using those profiles online. I'm not sure if you've seen them, but there's a lot of EQ profiles out there that EQ headphones to the Harman target. And what I wonder if, and maybe they'll try it out and they go, oh, I don't like this. This isn't for me. I prefer whatever the default frequency response. And what I wonder in those situations is if maybe there's an explanation for that. Like, for example, the preference for loudness. And when they're changing the EQ profile on and off, it has a difference in loudness for starters. Yeah. Or maybe there's another reason, like the headphone in question has some unit variation with the one that was used in creating the profile, and therefore there's maybe some deviations there that aren't being accounted for, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, all of those things are correct. I mean, when I started seeing people posting measurements and EQ corrections, that was surprising. I don't think an equivalent exists in the loudspeaker world, but yeah, so there's a lot of sources of variation, the unit to unit. I've done studies where we've measured 10 to 20 units of headphones, and the variations are quite large. So right. to think you can go online, select a measurement that someone's posted, and then that measurement is close to what you have at home. not likely. And then the other problem is that people will measure it on a different test fixture than what we
Right.
use to develop the Harman target. And that's a topic that I think we're going to be discussing later. But we've recently done studies measuring 20 headphones on different test fixtures, and some of the variations are quite huge. So you can't measure a headphone on a different test fixture that we used and assume that you're going to get the same results.
So actually, we might as well jump into that now. And it's something that it's funny because Blaine and I will talk about this topic, and even within the 711 standard, or what we call the 711 standard, like yeah, well, we notice there's differences among different fixtures, right? And now I guess we might as well talk about the exciting new B&K 5128 that wow, it was. I'll let Blaine take this this question.
Well, and I actually had if you don't mind me just slipping this in, because I don't think
Sure.
I've ever had a chance to. What led you to select the Gross fixtures for the original research over, for example, head acoustics or B&K?
Uh, I actually don't know the answer to that
That's fair.
question. We started off with just the grass 45, what's it called? AG?
Yeah,
45
the ear on a plate.
Oh,
Yeah,
45
yeah,
CA or 43 AG?
AG.
AG.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's a sort of a single channel with a pinna on a round plate. I think it's sort of the low cost version of the grass fixture. And
It's what Andrew
uh,
uses.
Yep.
yeah,
For now.
yeah.
Although we're
And
using anthropometric pinna KB 5000.
yeah, yeah. And I am at home now, so I have a Grass 45 CA10
Right.
with the anthropometric. So that was one of the test fixtures we included in the study. But so we started off with that, and then as we did more and more research and started testing more headphones, we needed a more efficient way. So we went to the 45 CA, which is the
Mhm.
that large
The hammer.
The old ear.
the hammer, yeah.
Yeah.
And we had Keymars, we had eventually we got a 5128, I think one of the first ones, but yeah, it was one of the lower cost solutions that we sort of trusted. But I have to say, even internally, there were heated discussions about how to measure headphones, and we had one researcher who designed his own test fixture, and it was basically I don't know if it was a piece of wood. It was a flat plate essentially with two microphones on it
Oh,
and no pinna. And his argument was, well, I get much more repeatability. And of course, having two microphones, you get a spatial average, so that helps minimize. And then you get very consistent measurements, but it doesn't, there's no coupler, so there's no ear canal simulation, there's no
Right.
acoustic impedance simulation. And we argued, this is fine for manufacturing to measure consistency, get a quick measurement, but if you want to, design it to a target, you need to include the simulator. So I think Todd Welty did a nice study where he compared headphone measurements on eight humans and compared it with the Grass 45 CA with his pinna versus this flat plate, and showed that when you use a flat plate with no pinna, you get a gross underestimation of leakage on a human. So
Right.
so anyway, we decided, but I have to tell you, even internally, and then AKG over in Austria had a completely different method of measuring headphones. They had all these brass ears with leaks and nothing standard at all. So
Interesting.
yeah. So just let me finish. One of the things that came out of this research is that within Harman, we finally agreed on a standard way to measure a headphone, which up until this research had been done, everyone was measuring on different fixtures.
Right. Out of curiosity, maybe this is in the Todd Welty study that you just referenced, but when people what I'm wondering, what do you make of when people see a measurement on a graph and go, I don't hear it like that? Is that just a difference in pinna, or would it be more down to a difference in coupling, or where do you see that occurring, or why, or yeah, the reason for that?
Well, I think a lot of it is leakage, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things we first found when we did our very first listening test was we had trained listeners draw the perceived spectral balance, and we found discrepancies between what we were measuring and what listeners were drawing. And one of the headphones was an AKG 550, which it has a lot of bass. It has 686 dB bass boost, but listeners were on average were drawing this thing rolling off at 100 hertz. So we went and measured it on listeners, and sure enough, for some people it sealed well. They got lots of bass. For half the people, it didn't seal well, and there was no bass. So we realized that controlling leakage, if you're doing subjective objective measurements and you want to get to this correlation, you have to control for leakage, which so we did all these listening tests and experiments controlling leakage, so we could get very meaningful conclusions. But in the real world, when you buy a headphone, you don't know whether it's going to leak or not. So that's something that's really, I think, the first step when you're designing a headphone is have a good understanding of how this headphone's going to leak or seal on the population of listeners that you're targeting.
And Blaine and I were just talking earlier that this it makes sense why open back headphones were selected for the the tests.
Yeah.
Open,
in fact.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can get into that shortly. But maybe just on the Blaine, if you had some questions about the 5128.
Right. So, wow. Okay, put me a little bit on the spot. That's off. We're a little bit off our schedule. Yeah. So for the 5128, I'm very interested to see the work that comes out of that. I know that you guys had mentioned that not all of it will be published publicly by Harman, but sorry, I'm off my roll.
So it's will there be in-room measurements of the 5128 is the first, I guess, question.
In ear?
In room.
Oh, in room. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Are you planning on replicating the in-room measurement of the 43AG and the 45CA in the Harman room with the 5128?
It's not currently on our agenda or schedule to do that, but it's within the realm of possibilities. Yeah, we could do that. I mean, yeah.
The reason I asked that is that the current system, the current curve that you have for adapting between the two is based on an average of 20 headphones, right?
Right. That's right.
And I can see why you would tend towards that, but my experience in doing similar things for 4128 and the Kemar is that while in aggregate you get a fairly good compensation, on individual examples, particularly where leakage or where there are narrow band peaks or dips, you run into more problems. And so I was curious, the current system you have basically treats the aggregate of the 45CA as the target. Does that basically mean that the 45CA is going to be the reference point because it has the existing body of preference research, and the 5128 is going to basically be a comparison point only?
I mean, for now, yeah, that's true. We'll use the 45CA as the tool to determine whether we fit our design targets, because all the research is based on that. But I think over time we may accumulate more data on the 5128, and for the time being, at least we can use this modified curve for that test fixture and get closer to how it sounds than it currently exists. Because I think I showed an example in this talk I gave of there's a if you take a headphone measured on a 5128, the predicted score can be off by 45 points on a 100-point scale. So and with this correction, you can get within, on average 7 points. The other test.
Just to
Go
clarify, that being off when you applied the Harman target that was derived using the 45 CA.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, did you ever compare? And this is just a bugbear of mine, but something in the 2013, just for context, in 2013 paper, you compared the in-room flat response to the diffuse field target. Have you tried comparing the scores if the 5128's official diffuse field HRTF is compensated with the adjustments you've made to the in-room flat target and how that affects the predicted score?
That's not something we've looked into yet. Yeah.
So more stuff is being done on the 5128 eventually. Is that the the gist of that?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not. I mean, I'd like to understand how all these test fixtures differ because in the field, and everyone's using different test fixtures, and so I like to understand how to interpret those measurements. And if the B&K gets critical mass and starts to be used a lot in the industry, then we'll need to understand how to interpret those measurements.
I mean, I'm optimistic that something like that's going to happen, but I wanted to ask as well. I mean, with the decision to make the B&K or the 5128 research private, are you able to talk at all to the reasoning behind that? Like, was it just Harman's choice, or what? What went into that?
Yeah, before I gave the talk, I sent my presentation to people in my own group, and I asked the question: do we want to make it easy for people to use this to interpret measurements made on the test fixture? And just based on recent conversations, it seems within Harman there's less willingness to do published research that will enable competitors to make better products. So it was just viewed as we don't need to show this if it's going to help our competitors. So, and that's just a recent change that I've come across. So,
I mean, that actually leads into one of my next questions, which is sort of the relationship between Harman International or I suppose the research that you're doing and the various different products that have a Harman company associated with them. So the AKG, Samsung, JBL, and yeah, if you could talk maybe about that relationship just in general.
Yeah, so Harman is in 2016 we were acquired by Samsung, but the relationship is we're a completely independently run subsidiary. So I don't interface much with Samsung. There is some collaboration, and collaborating right now with some of the Samsung team that's developing earbuds. So the Harman headphone brands for headphones would be JBL, AKG, and to a lesser extent AKG, Harman Kardon. So they basically, there's no influence in design or anything from Samsung. Now Samsung is using our research they apply it to the Samsung buds, which I think are branded as Sound by AKG.
Right.
So yes. So that's basically the relationship.
I suppose then that means that the expectation would be that those products would be tuned to the Harman target to as much as they can be.
Yeah, if you look at the Samsung earbuds, they are very, very close to the Harman target.
Do you think, I mean, given some of the segmentation that exists in the research, do you think that there might be something targeted to either of the other two groups, the groups that prefer more bass or the groups that prefer less bass, maybe also broken down into different, maybe targeting different age groups or things like that? Or does it just make the most sense to aim for that majority 64%?
Well, so in the last year or two, JBL has decided to follow the Harman target curve, but with more bass. So if you buy a JBL headphone, it may have an extra 2 or 3 dB more bass than the Harman target, and that's based on they see JBL as a youth brand aimed at younger
Right.
uh, younger demographics, and AKG's decided to go strictly Harman target because for a broader appeal to get that 64%. Now, there's nothing stopping people. I mean, most of our headphones come with apps, so they can go in and reduce the bass, increase the bass. That's completely possible, and I've done this with some of our JBL headphones, which personally, I'm not a young guy, so I like to turn the bass down a little bit, and I can hit the Harman target just using the app. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, it's something that was one of the things that was not surprising in the research, being that the younger listeners preferred more bass and that the older listeners, although, I mean, as it said, it was only the 55 plus group, I think, or something like that, that preferred it to be a little bit counterclockwise tilted, if I remember correctly. And it wasn't that big a difference from what I would have expected. So I suppose that was surprising to a certain degree.
yeah. So I mean, that's one of the, this this is the first time in my career where we've actually given knobs to people. I mean, all the loudspeaker research, we just assumed that flat is flat. Other than no, we've never really given knobs. So this was the first time where we kind of zoomed in on here's something that's flat or neutral. Adjust this to what you like, and it was surprising to see that. It was for me because I didn't have any expectation that younger people, untrained people, also, so experienced listeners who are trained tend to like less bass, uh, which makes me suspicious of audiophiles who say, when, yeah, by default they're going to say, I don't like that because I'm an expert listener. So
Right.
I don't. I'm joking, but yeah, that was the first time I think I've seen data that shows this demographic influence on what your tastes are in terms of bass and treble, and the people that are older, we think that's related to hearing loss.
Right.
So,
Right. Could be.
uh,
Yeah.
and if you're having hearing loss, it generally affects high frequencies first, and so people are turning down the bass and increasing the treble because reducing the bass helps unmask speech frequencies that are important for intelligibility.
Right.
So,
Interesting. So does that mean there is less correlation with reduced bass for people who are older but have like a normal range audiogram?
yeah, if I understand your question, yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
I hadn't been aware of that. I'd sort of conjectured it, but I wasn't aware that that was.
So this is at this point really speculation because we didn't do a large enough study with people with hearing loss. We didn't for these 200 or 300 people. We never tested their hearing, so it's completely conjecture at this point. And we were so I'd love to see a large study done where all those factors are tested and controlled, and audiograms are taken, so we can really nail how hearing loss affects your preference.
Right. Moving on from that topic, actually, Blaine had some questions about the target specifically. So the questions about smoothing and
Yes.
and that type of stuff. So actually, yeah, Blaine, why don't you go
Yeah.
ahead?
So, probably the most common complaint I've heard from people who've actually read the Harman studies, as opposed to the many people who make complaints about the Harman studies without reading them, which I would say is a quite large majority, is, and Jude Mansilla has voiced this one, and it's actually one that I kind of share. The in-room flat bass line that the 2013 shell filters were applied to, that the adjustment to the shape of the ear gain in the 2018 was applied to, are relatively coarse measurements. They are not a large number of points per octave. I don't actually know the exact number. The number I think Judah said was 2 or 4 points per octave, but I'm not positive. Do you think that that's sufficient resolution, given the frequency resolution of the human ear? Because like headphones have a lot of features that are quite a bit thinner than that, and HRTFs do as well when measured at high res.
Yeah, I mean, when you're measuring something in a room, a speaker in a room, there's a lot of, first of all, you need to do some averaging because there's a lot of interference, acoustic interference between the direct sound and the reflections. So there's frequency smoothing applied. And then we also did some spatial averaging where we moved the head to 3 different positions, plus or minus, I think 30 degrees or 15 degrees. So I mean, I think the justification was you don't want to have any of those artifacts in the measurements. And secondly, up to, I don't know, 2 or 3 kilohertz, the smoothing doesn't affect any directional cues per se. So what you're really smoothing are perhaps above 3K directional cues. And I think the rationale was, well, we don't want to encode those in the headphone because they're very individualistic. And if people start designing headphones to have all these peaks and dips, it may not be, it may sound good for some person who's going to match that, but it may not be so good for someone who has a different shape pinna. So,
all right.
But anyways, that's the rationale behind that.
And so, would that apply also for circumaural headphones, where you do have pinna effects for the headphone? Like, if you swap a headphone, obviously, I mean, you've seen this with the 5128 and the 45CA, but if you swap a circumaural headphone from one ear to another, you see changes in things like the frequency, amplitude, and phase of the cancellation around the so-called canal or pinna notch, but also the other HRTF features. Do you feel that there should be that you shouldn't individualize measurements on the fixture to those as well? Because like, from my point of view, well, I mean, the common one people see is people think that you should EQ up the dip on circumaural headphones measured on the Gross fixtures, or EQ like down. Yeah. And EQ down the spike, or EQ up the spike on the, or EQ down the spike on the 4128, sorry, which is in the same place. But those are actually HRTF features of the fixture, and if you EQ those, you end up with, at least in my experience, subjectively impaired timbre. So,
and just to see if I understand that correctly, it's the issue of the coarse-grained target versus the fine-grained headphone response.
Well, and fixture response. Like the HRTF, the fixture actually has a feature there, which the headphone is accurately, like the headphone is not bypassing, but which if you equalize in counter to it, you can actually end up with a subjective change in response.
Yeah. I mean, I think, if the fixture has like the 45 CA10 with the anthropomorphic pinna has this dip at 10K, right?
Somewhere around there.
Yeah. So if you were to equalize that out when you design your headphone, first of all, it's very, very narrow for high Q. And if it's generally a bad idea to apply a high Q peak to a narrow notch, because if there's a shift in manufacturing or whatever, and it doesn't quite line up, you're suddenly adding this huge resonance to the headphone, and that's going to sound terrible. So I think generally when you're doing equalization, you want to regularize your measurements or your filters and avoid those sort of situations. So I think that's another reason to,
lost my camera.
Yeah, I think your camera over.
It's okay. Continue. I'm still here.
Yeah. So So I don't think you want to start equalizing a headphone to, if there's a narrow Q caused by the fixture.
Okay, fair enough. What about like broader fiction? Well, like the difference between say, 2 and 5K between the 45CA and the 5128 that you found. Those aren't as narrow Q, but those are, you could see them as being part of sort of the static HRTF of that fixture. And the granularity of the changes that you made is greater than the granularity of the original in-room measurement.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking me questions I have to sit down and think hard about.
Sorry about that.
Uh, I mean, certainly with the paper I just gave, we didn't do any smoothing when we came up with this correction. So that all the measurements were done at 1/48th octave on the headphones, and when we're comparing them across fixtures, where there's no smoothing. So when you look at the corrections or the modified targets, there's no smoothing applied in that case.
I'll be back in a second. I'm just going to wait for my camera to stop overheating.
Okay.
Not using my usual camera right now, so that's why that happened.
Yeah. I do admittedly have a bit of an agenda with this one, and I'm sorry. I guess you mentioned off stream before that you were worried this might be a trap. This is probably the closest thing to a trap there is here, and I swear it's nothing major. But on ASR, I brought up Chris Struck's paper on basically modeling in-room HRTFs from anechoic data.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's been sort of a personal bee in my bonnet since I read that, which was, I didn't actually read that when it came out, but I thought it was incredible, and I found it was, that's something that could allow us to sort of square the circle of, if there are relatively small but directionally consistent HRTF features that matter for the sound, we don't have to necessarily give up the in-room response or the measurement resolution with that model.
Yeah, I mean, I reread that paper the other day after you mentioned it, and that's possible. I looked at his results, and they seem to be, the overall, he gave sort of a range of targets based on how much free field and diffuse field was combined, but it seemed a bit high in the 3K region.
And I will note that his measurements are based on his source data is a 4128C, which actually has more in that area on my measurements when compared to the KEMAR.
Yeah. So that was something that was interesting. And then, finally at the end of this paper, he says, well, this all needs to be validated through listening and
yes.
and measurements in real rooms versus models, and getting the absorption characteristics of a room in a model is always kind of tricky as well. So you need to really know the absorption coefficients of all the materials and so on. So it's at this point, I would say it needs more validation, but it was
that you might consider.
Well, perhaps. I mean, it's probably a good project for a PhD summer student or something like that. Just let them work away at it, but or maybe a student who's listening might want to spend 4 years looking into this. But
someone was asking how you get into audio research in the chat earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my research projects these days are measured in 10 months. So the idea of spending 4 years on something is not part of the current culture.
Makes sense.
I had a question about just more about the 5128 in general, and there's, I guess, currently some, partially after the HBK thing, some question as to the merits of adopting essentially that as the new sort of standard, in part because of all the stuff above 10K. I'm just wondering, what your sense is on the 5128 and its usefulness over some of the stuff that we've been using, like the 43AG and the 45CA and the KEMAR stuff. And just what's your general sense of the 5128 as a new standard moving forward?
I think what I like about it is it's based on research where they've actually measured 40 subjects. It seems as though they've done a good job of modeling the acoustic impedance of the ear, and it's a more accurate representation of the ear canal, physically. So I'm working. I hope to be working on this project where we look more in more depth in high frequency performance, because
right.
as it's well known, the 711 coupler above 8 or 10K, no one really knows. It's all bets are off, and that's one of the reasons why the Harman target, or the model that we use based on the Harman target, doesn't even look at data above 10K, because we have no confidence in the acoustic measurement, and we have no confidence in the subjective data, because just putting the headphone on and off, you get a different response, especially at high frequencies. So I think I think it has a promising future in research above 10K, and if this research happens, I'll be certainly using it to measure headphones as well as a 45CA.
Right.
To document the high frequency performance. My concern about the 5128 is not so much at high frequencies, but at low frequencies, where with the circumoral headphones, we got a very large leakage effect. And so it comes down to the question, how accurate or how representative is the B&K head cheek, in terms of humans.
Yep.
And I don't know if they've done that study. I mean, they measured ear canals. They looked at that aspect, but is the mannequin, is the shape of the head anthropomorphically average, or what does it represent?
Yeah,
that actually I can answer. The 5128 is still based on the measurements that I think underpin the ICUT P58 standard, and that is an anthropomorphic average of a number of key simplified head dimensions, but it's not necessarily indicative of average leakage performance. And I think thus far Todd Welty's paper with the 45CA is the most thorough investigation of how on head, on humans, and on fixture-based measurements compare.
The other thing that needs to be considered there is that audiophiles all have really large heads. And so we need actually to have a larger mannequin head than probably the average.
Have we measured Sean's head?
Are they large physically or just large
right?
Psychologically?
Oh, maybe it's to contain all that extra brain matter up there to be able to hear things like detail.
So, I mean, that's the missing piece in this research, and we were hoping to do that next. So we measured all these test fixtures with 20 headphones, and we understand how they leak with these headphones. And then the next part of the study was to actually measure these 20 headphones on a large number of subjects, and put microphones at the blocked entrance, and that's where new management came in, and we had to stop doing that. So
really,
so if we can find a PhD student willing to do that, that would be a great project.
Very interesting. So I guess the summary question then would be, with the 5128, is should we get one? Just speaking with Jude, he seems to think it's a very good idea, and we're also leaning towards it. So in some ways, it's as much as it might be more. I was gonna say, in some ways, as much as it might be more accurate, the fact that there isn't a Harman target for us to steal makes it a little bit less useful than, at least currently, right, than the KEMAR stuff. So in some ways, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the reviewer Critical, who's in the chat right now as well, but I think he's been on record for saying that there's life left in the 711 standard, particularly because there is there's so much. It's so ubiquitous, and there's so much data on it already. But yeah.
So we have the 5128. They've now, which includes the torso and the mouth simulator. What's the price of just the I don't know what they call it, 5128B, or is it
I think
C?
Blaine actually looked this up recently.
So the B is the one that's just the head on a boot. The C is the one that has the torso.
Yeah.
Right.
And I like the head boot.
And how much is the one without the torso?
I'm not sure B&K wants me to say that, but
okay.
like approximately 40% less. It's like a meaningful difference.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's probably the one we'll get if we do.
So it's very costly from the neck down then.
That's right.
For fiberglass at that, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean that's the issue, right? For a lot of people, spending $40,000 on a test fixture is just it's a non-starter.
Right.
Versus a 45 CA, which is maybe 13. I don't know.
Yeah, I have just general worries about representing frequency response without the context of the various different features of the measurement equipment. There's a pretty big difference. There's a massive difference between the mini DSP ears rig. I see someone in the chat talking about mini DSP ears, and any of the Gross systems or the 4128 and the 711 couplers, and then there's also there's a knockoff of that, and so without the context of that, when you see the measurement there, I worry that there's that frequency response in general has become a bit of a beast that is the cat's out of the bag, right? It's a little bit too difficult now, especially now given that there are so many different fixtures. And I'm just wondering if you think there's a solution to this, or now these newer, cheaper knockoff rigs coming out that aren't as accurate, and what do we do? Is it just up to us to explain it better?
Well, I mean, we have a mini DSP ears, and we were going to use it to illustrate why you don't want to use it, but I think people like Brent Butterworth and other people have already gone through that exercise. Yeah,
he did a great thing on that, on the differences with even just the different pinnas for the 43AG as well.
Yeah. I really appreciated Brent's Brent's series of measurements on that.
Yeah, that was helpful. So that saved us. Unfortunately, it's too late to ship it back, but we
$200 or something.
Yeah, when we bought it, it was I think 180. It was even less, but I don't know. I mean, I think people are going to do this until because of the cost issue, I think, and of course, headphone companies can always guard against this by releasing measurements on industry standard test fixtures, and no one's doing that to my knowledge.
So this is what
Harman, I guess, is indirectly through you.
Where there's that.
Well, I do it, but I don't know if management knows I'm doing it, but
you sold a lot of K371s, I'll tell you that, including one to a friend of mine just yesterday.
I mean, I do this, on my own accord, though. I'm not told to do it, and I'm always taking a risk when I do it. But which is, but I also explain what the measurements mean and how to interpret them. So as long as you have confidence that the headphone measures well and it sounds good, then. So I hope we get to the point in our industry where people, manufacturers, there's this standard that people publish measurements and specs that so that people become familiar and know how to interpret them and don't have to rely on these test fixtures made out of footballs and microphones.
Oh God!
So actually, that brings me to another topic, which is, the research is out there, and people know about this, right? The manufacturers, they must know about the research, and whether they've read it or not. But what I'm wondering is what your what's sort of your reaction when you come across maybe a high-end headphone, or a manufacturer's released a high-end headphone where clearly it's not even remotely close to the to the, what the target, shows as the most preferred? Is it just a matter of them thinking that they know better, or I suppose, yeah, what do you make of that?
So if I understand your question, what do I think when they claim they hit the Harman
No, no,
target,
no.
but they don't? Oh,
More so that, given that this research exists and there's such a wide body of research there,
yeah.
their
Maybe an
decision
example would help.
Yeah, I'm thinking of. Now I'm gonna. Okay, so I recently measured the Abyss AB1266, and it's a $5,000 headphone, and actually it's not unique to that. I mean, I would actually go as far as to say that most, ultra high end headphones, out of all of them that exist, the really expensive ones, there's only a handful that actually do achieve, a frequency response that's reasonably close. And so I suppose the question is more along the lines of, are they just ignoring it? Are they just is there, what do you think is the reasoning that goes into not taking that research into consideration?
I mean, I can't get inside their heads and know what they're thinking. Uh, um, I mean, some companies, it's always existed in audio, whether it's headphones or loudspeakers, where some people will just they're not trying to uh, design or engineer something that's neutral or accurate. They want to editorialize the music
Right.
or the art, and you know, there may be a small percentage of people that like that, but all the science tells us that those people are rare. And given the opportunity to sit down and compare that anomaly to something that's neutral, they'll often choose the neutral. So that maybe they just haven't had the opportunity to compare that with something good. I'm thinking of the consumer now. I mean,
I love the phrasing of that, by the way. That was excellent. But so I had this thought that maybe it was because, like we often see, especially with planar magnetic headphones, that in the ultra high end stuff, there's a significant boost in the upper treble frequencies. And I had this thought that maybe it's because they're targeting people who are a bit older as well, and so maybe there is some conscious effort there in making it hit them.
yeah. Well, certainly the more in I used to go to high-end audio shows, and I was like one of the younger people there now. Now, at age 62, I'm still one of the younger people at these shows.
Yeah.
It's a dying industry, right? So if you're selling something that's very expensive, it's likely an older person, and maybe they are compensating for hearing loss. Who knows? But with headphones, I think it's a bit different. There's a lot of it tends to be a hobby that's for a younger person. I don't know what the research shows us, but I think the kind of customer we have, it's definitely on the younger side. So
Yeah,
I don't.
earbuds and headphones and any portable device.
Yeah, so it's a young demographic. When I went to my first Cam Jam a couple of years ago, and there's two things that impressed me. First, how young they are, and secondly, how technical they are. I mean, people were coming up to me, asking me technical questions. Some of them had read my research. There were a lot of them were college students who had their own measurements, and they were DIYers,
Yeah.
do-it-yourselfers, and a very technical savvy customer that just does not exist in the old loudspeaker high-end shows. So I don't think you can fool these people. I think they're more science driven, they're more technical driven, and they seem to uh, thirst for measurements and technical data, which I find very encouraging.
Yeah, I was going to say that I imagine that's going to push the industry in a very positive direction over the next however many years, where the more people
Yeah,
are focused on that. And as you're saying, that manufacturers might as well publish their measurements, because folks like myself or Clinical or some other folks who are doing this kind of stuff, we're going to measure it anyways. So that information is going to be out there.
Yeah, you can't hide any longer behind marketing and stories, sales stories, when the data is out there. And with speakers, you'd have to invest in, $500,000 to measure it like we do. But with headphones, $10,000 or less is the entry level for good test equipment. And so yeah, the data is out there, and I think it's in the interest. If you make a good product, you should publish your measurements. But that's easier said than done.
Yeah. But maybe eventually. I mean, I am seeing in a number of different places that measurements and data are being used as marketing material when it does, achieve a good result. So that's encouraging to see.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, Blaine.
I just had a question regarding, I suppose, stuff that is not Harman compliant. And I'm, asking for a friend, but if someone were to, for example, design a headphone that didn't conform well to the Harman target with the explicit advice to EQ it to the Harman target for example, a very low acoustic Z out so that there was less of that in situ variation, would that be something that we could consider a reasonable design choice? Like in the modern day, most audiophiles, particularly people listening with desktop rigs, have EQs. So if a manufacturer, for example, provided instructions on how to equalize a headphone,
or
but
profiles themselves, like what Odyssey does for some of them.
Precisely. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I mean, I kind of, I'm always amused when I read reviews of a headphone that's measures horribly, and people say, well, this is a really good headphone with EQ, of course.
Because theoretically, any headphone could be good with EQ. Is that?
Yeah. So why did the manufacturer make it so you don't need EQ to begin with, and then if you want to tweak it, that's a case where I just don't understand why you would do that. But I think the idea of a manufacturer providing EQ, like Odyssey, if you have a rune, I guess you can use that to, they have provided EQs. Yeah. I actually haven't done this, but it's an interesting area.
Yeah, I think, well, to Blaine's question as well, though, I think one of the reasons was, or at least it was being suggested, was that there's less potential variation from coupling. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you're designing a headphone, well, let's take the example of the headphones that best conform to the Harman target acoustically. So passive headphones. You're talking about stuff like Dan Clark Audio. You're talking about stuff like the AKG K371.
Hi-Fi Sundara. It's right there.
Well, yeah, not
without
the
the base shelf. Yeah.
By majority, those designs are more vulnerable to leakage than, for example, the less Harman compliant open backs and open front volume circumaural designs that you tend to use for your research. So it's fairly difficult, at least from my experience, to achieve Harman style bass response from a design that doesn't vary substantially in the presence of small leaks. So basically what I'm asking is, do you think it's a reasonable thing to say this headphone, in the same way that, for example, a compression driver isn't suitable without, in a constant direct activity horn isn't going to be right without EQ, to make a headphone that is specifically designed to be EQ'd and performs in other areas like being more robust to positional variation.
Like physical limitations on the design that make it so it's not really as easy to achieve the bass.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I understand now. So yeah, I mean, if in the case of Sundara, or I have a pair here, and it has very on the 800, which you're aware, we use this in research because we measured it on a bunch of people and it never varies. So excellent headphone for doing research where you want to minimize variability. So in that case, I think that's a perfectly rational reason to design it so it has minimal variation with position and listeners, and then provide a means to equalize it to whatever target the manufacturer wants.
And this has been my contention for a long time, that in some ways the defining characteristics of Harman these days, I think about whether or not something adheres to the Harman target. I think more about that base shelf, because the upper mids in my mind, or at least the elements that are derived from the in-room target, in my mind, those are the essential constants that need to be there. Whereas it's the bass and treble aspects that, in particular with the open headphones, that maybe in the bass it's harder to achieve.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I actually, Blaine, was there anything else that you wanted to?
Oh no, I've
Okay.
taken enough.
I wanted
of
to
that.
get there's.
Thank you very much.
There's oops, there we go. The camera's done it again. This
He's
is a
overheated
problem
again.
with these Sony cameras, is they have this issue.
You're just too hot.
That's right.
You need to go out. You need to go outdoors. I don't know.
See, now I have Sean Olive telling me I need to go outdoors.
You're in Canada.
That's right.
Can't be that warm outdoors.
No, it's
He's
not.
barely in Canada.
That's right. Yeah, just in
I'm only
Vancouver.
slightly less in Canada than you are.
Yeah.
I'm in California. It was 48. It was in the 40s last night, and getting cold here.
Yeah. I did have. I wanted to get, I guess, into some of the additional minutia. I have some more questions, if you don't mind. But one of them is surrounds or it's about the statistical model for predicting headphone preference. And I don't know, Blaine, I think I explained it to you, but I've sort of, I want to make sure that I get it out correctly, but the thought process out correctly. But the way I understand that is that you have there's essentially a method of representing headphone deviations from the target as error, or as a sort of a certain kind of scoring, right? So how close it gets to the target. And my question with that is, do you think, and again, maybe Blaine can explain this better, but do you think it's possible to have a situation where adding more deviation could make the headphones sound better? Say, for example, if the deviation in question, say, a headphone measures with a particular deviation, a boost at around like 3K, 4K, and that it matches the target for the rest of the frequency response. With a fairly narrow Q for that deviation, I can see a situation where having the rest of the harmonics balanced out in the lower treble, mid treble, and upper treble would actually be subjectively preferred, even though the net score would be worse, if that makes sense. I don't know, maybe Blaine can frame that question better than I've done.
So, as I understood this when you framed it to me, basically what you're asking is, if the treble as a whole is out of alignment with the Harman target, but there is a bit that is dipped, it's conceivable that EQing that bit up and making the treble evenly out of alignment could be subjectively preferable to dipping an additional bit but still leaving it uneven.
That's right. Yeah.
So basically it's asking if there should be considerations of bands rather than just the whole of the response for mean error.
And waiting for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a very simple model. There's only two variables, and one of them is standard deviation, which is how far does it deviate from the target, and then there's this the slope, the absolute slope of a line that goes of the error curve. So you can have some deviations from the target, but still have the error curve can have a flat or zero slope, and having the slope close to zero will produce a higher score. And this allows, headphones like a Sundara or an open back headphone to not have bass, but it's somewhat tamed if they bring the mid-range down, so that the deviation over a larger bandwidth is, the error curve is flat.
Right.
So it seems it's very sensitive to the slope of the error curve. So, and that's seems to be perceptually important because we seem to hear or be sensitive to the overall spectral balance, how it how flat it is or how even it is over a large bandwidth.
Do you think that that all do you think all deviations are equal, or is there some areas that are worse than others?
Yeah, I mean, I did look into different bands, and we did some analysis of different bands, and it didn't really seem to matter. What we did find is that at lower frequencies below 50 hertz, that mattered. Yeah, that mattered less.
Yeah.
And above 10K, it seemed to matter less as well. And that could be there's less content in the music, could be people's hearing, and then there was a lot of errors in the measurements because I mentioned earlier because of the couplers and so on. So there is a part of the band, low frequencies and very high frequencies that seem to be less important in the listening test results, and that's about as. But in between those 2 points, there was nothing particular that produced higher predictions. So as a result, it's just a broadband metric.
Right. And this is consistent with my assumption that, or congruent with my assumption that ear gain is essential. And that is the essential component. It needs to be.
Yeah. It's interesting because the very first test we did, there was an Odyssey LCD2.
Right.
And, and this was a test where you put the actual headphones on, and people generally like this. And as we did more and more tests with it, it didn't score as well. It's clear that this lack of ear gain was basically the culprit.
Yeah. Well, incidentally, they've improved it a little bit in the newer models, thankfully. So that's, maybe I'm not sure if it's a direct result of seeing that feedback, but it's certainly a good thing. I suppose we can move on to some other topics. Blaine, is there anything in particular that you'd like to jump to?
Well, the chat is starting to get slightly ornery about something that we figured would come up.
Yeah. Which
is the question of non-FR variables.
So, for example, if what would happen, or do you think it's there's something else that might be predictive of sound quality if frequency response is the constant?
In headphones, to be clear.
Headphones.
Yeah. I mean, we looked at distortion, nonlinear distortion. There's a paper we did with Listen, Steve Tebby, which I think you mentioned. And I mean, that's not the last word on the audibility of distortion, but it's very clear that we had to really look hard to find a headphone that had high distortion in that study. And we found when you equalize all the headphones to the same frequency response, suddenly they're all rated very similarly. So the distortion, with the exception of 1 or 2 headphones, it wasn't sufficiently high enough that it affected their scores. So,
right. So I suppose, and the chat is asking about this, the question then would be, what do we make of the audiophile terms like detail and microdynamics and all this stuff? Where I use them as well, and I should probably clarify my position on that, which is that I wouldn't at all be surprised if that is contained within frequency response, right? But more so, do you leave the door open for there being potentially something? Well, either something else, measurable that's there, or testable that's there when frequency response and distortion are controlled for, or is it a matter of analyzing frequency response or some of these existing metrics in terms of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of these details that you mentioned, I don't know what microdynamics is.
Neither do most people.
Yeah, so
most people who use it.
Yeah.
So the first problem is you have to confirm that these things that people are describing actually exist. Can you reliably can you present them stimulus or stimuli, and they can consistently identify them. And then you can start examining the physical properties of the headphone in terms of the acoustic measurements. You can look in the time domain, the frequency domain. And I think if you did a thorough study, eventually you could get to the bottom of, can people reliably describe this attribute? Is it really the same as some other attribute? Because
Right.
there's studies where they've had listeners describe speakers or headphones, and they do factor analysis, and they find that out of the 500 words they use, basically there's maybe 7 or 9 that capture all the same thing. So, but I think eventually you could uncover what this is and what attributes to this attribute.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned time domain here, because Blaine and I have been under the working hypothesis that this is all just another way of looking at frequency response as well.
Working hypothesis.
Yeah.
That's
well, I've been under the working
that's
hypothesis.
linear time invariant system theory.
Yes.
That's not a working hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, I just threw that out to appease some of these people. But I often, it's like these people they've never heard of Fourier, and they don't seem to understand that there's a relationship between time and frequency, and most of the behavior.
Oh, I think.
I can't hear Sean.
Yeah, I think maybe the earbuds are dying.
My earbud. I'm using my microphone.
Oh, okay. Now we can hear. Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, you were getting very far away.
Yeah. No, I mean, a lot of times the two are the same, right? As long as the system is behaving in a linear fashion, you can go from time to frequency, and you get the same result. So, you can look at ringing in a system, in a headphone or a loudspeaker, and that is in parallel. That would be a very high Q resonance. And so, to me, it usually makes more sense to look in the frequency domain.
Right.
We understand the relationship between resonances, thresholds, and so on. And ringing is a little harder to interpret.
Okay. We are getting some sound quality degradation. I'm not sure if it's related to internet or what's going on. But
yeah, it's interesting. You get very vague.
That's the sound qualities. Yeah. The microphone maybe. Yeah, it says submerged underwater. Okay, that's okay.
It does sound like you're sinking a bit.
Yeah, but no, I think I take the point though. It's that we can look at these metrics in various different number of ways, but there is potentially something there. You could set up a study where you could uncover certain things that people are identifying. Blaine and I have, or at least this has been my
It looks as though somehow my microphone, I have a microphone here, it got switched over to the mic in my headphones.
That's what the problem is.
That would make sense.
We're good now.
Yeah.
That would explain why it made that horrible noise when you were adjusting them.
When did that happen? Just now?
I think it was like that the whole time.
That's the whole time.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. This is much better though.
Yeah.
High res Sean Olive.
Yeah, exactly. Blaine and I were talking before about maybe ways of just sort of theorizing how one of these studies could be set up. But one idea might be to take what is something that is a very subjectively well received headphone, like a very high end headphone for these types of qualities, things that audiophiles describe as detail and whatnot,
and the ones that are specifically ostensibly different, even when the FR is the same.
Yeah, exactly right, because we do EQ everything to the same, and another driver that would fit into that same headphone that is subjectively in a headphone that is subjectively received as quite bad. Bad, but then EQ'd all to the same FR. And incidentally, the ones that we're thinking of both do reasonably well for their distortion behavior as well, like below whatever audible threshold there might be. I'm just wondering if this is the kind of thing that might, be effective at revealing some of these other things. I mean, we'd be able to say something like, disregarding what those particular things are, but rather just saying, A, is there a difference, and B, is one of them preferable? And then supposing that the latter is supposing that one of them is preferable, that they're not, received as the same, then we would be able to, go down the path and figure out, the next thing. Just wonder what your take is on that type of study, or if you think there needs to be additional controls, or because one of the things that you've controlled for with the virtual method is things like weight and comfort and all these different things that can influence, people's perceptions.
Yeah. So just to make sure I get this right, you have a headphone that has some of these magical properties.
Yeah.
Yes, the enchanted headphone.
Exactly.
Enchanted headphone. So it has like 100 on the detail scale, but it has terrible frequency response.
No. Actually,
take it.
In this case, it has let's say it has 100 on the detail scale, but it also has a reasonably good frequency response.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the other headphone that we're thinking of is maybe a 2 or 3 on the detail scale, or like a 5. I don't know, like a lower, right? And also has a generally agreeable frequency response. And in this case, it would be very easy to get them to match for frequency response. And the thought process is, could we do some sort of test? Also, conveniently, they happen to be drivers that are roughly the same size and shape. So theoretically, we could put one into the enclosure of the other, and then randomize and tell people not tell people which is which, something like that.
Yeah. So as you said, they would be putting these physically on their head. So you would have to have some way, I would think, to control for that. You could, for example, equalize the same headphone several different ways so that, they never know whether they're listening to the real headphone or the actual headphone or some filtered version of it, or you'd have to do something to control for these possible, biases. In other approaches, you could, make binaural recordings of them and play them through what's considered a super accurate headphone that imparts no distortion of its own to the sound.
It's funny you mentioned that, because that's something Blaine and I are actually in the process of doing.
Yes, the intention is to record a pair of flat equalized headphones that are good and a pair that are bad, and see if those two recordings can be reliably differentiated.
Yeah.
But actually, on that subject, I'd want to get your take on the value of sound demos, if you'd like to go there.
I do want to note I'm personal friends with Olaf, so
actually, in my opinion, his are like the best, let's say, example of that, because there are other people doing sound demos where it's literally just on a box, and it's not even, there's no attempt to make them, sound close to what those actually sound like. But yeah, just what are your thoughts in general on the value there?
Yeah, I think this is another subject I think Brett Butterworth touched on. And I try to recall what he did to sort of make his point. I don't know do you recall that study he did?
No, I'm not sure.
I think,
was it one of his Soundstage solo articles, or was it somewhere
else?
Else?
Yeah, it was in Soundstage, and it generated a lot of angry replies, because this topic seems to be very divisive whenever anyone even tries to be critical on an objective basis. But the basic issue is that when you record a headphone on your own ears or on a mannequin and then post it on YouTube, you have no idea of what headphone the person has on the other end. So it's a very uncontrolled test.
Right.
And when there's a lack of controls.
You just posted the study.
Yeah. So that's basically the main issue. Now, people will argue, well, you can use them to hear relative differences, and that may be illustrative. So you could say, yeah, this one has more bass, this one has less bass, this one. But to make an absolute judgment of the headphone, I think is that's where you fall into ambiguous territory.
Right.
In a scenario where you knew what the listeners are going to be using, let's say that you forced people to sign a TOS that said, I'm going to use a Sennheiser HD 599 for playback. And you equalized to subtract the transfer function of the microphone, the recording ear, and the 599. Would you say that would be a reason? I mean, that'd be relatively similar to your headphone demo system, right?
Yeah, I think yeah. I mean, there's no doubt you can if you calibrate the entire system from beginning to end, that you can do you can legitimately use this method. And we have done that. I mean, we've made binaural room impulse responses of cars and loudspeakers and calibrated the entire system, and you get pretty good correlations with those recordings versus the in situ comparisons. So it's been demonstrated that it's possible, but I just don't see that level of control in these recordings.
Yeah, I think my biggest concern there is that, I mean, because of the compounding effect of the, whatever the person's wearing, so much of, I mean, the entire project hinges on exactly that, of having the right, having the listener have the right setup. And I just think people are so much more experientially based that I can, pontificate till I'm blue in the face about how close the headphone gets to the target, and it won't matter. It won't be treated as equally valuable as when compared with an actual experiential thing that somebody can hear, whether it's right or wrong, right? Whether it's a accurate representation or not. And so because it's almost like the inverse problem of the what Mary didn't know phenomenon in epistemology, where you get experiential knowledge without having any additional framing or context or any other kind of knowledge. And that experiential
framing and context you may want to give the viewers and possibly Dr. Olive.
Context. Yeah. So there's the What Mary Didn't Know paper, Frank Jackson in epistemology, which is you can it's a person who's kept in a very dark room, black, no light in the room, and the person is given all kinds of information about color, all the information a person could possibly know about color. And the point of the paper is that until this person steps out of that completely pitch black room and experiences color for the first time, there's still something left to learn about color. And it's the experiential component there. And I think with sound demos, you have kind of like the inverse problem where people will experience something and think that because they've experienced this, that they know what the thing actually sounds like. Even though it's not an accurate representation of what it actually sounds like. And that's so much more compelling than if you were to sit in front of a camera and explain target adherence and measurements and things like that. It's not only more difficult, but also you don't get that experiential component with that. And so my concern with sound demos is less of one in principle or in theory, because I think as you've pointed out that it is possible to demonstrate this in the right situations, but more so in practice, that you can't expect everybody to have this exact situation, and so you're going to end up misleading people. That's sort of just my concern there, more of a practical one. But wondering if there's anything else we should cover, because we have talked about a lot. Blaine, is there anything else that we should go over before we do the Q&A session, because we're going to get to that?
The 10th thing that you had on your list, I think, is pretty. We haven't specifically addressed, and also
okay.
you have two things that we haven't.
I have a bunch of things.
Yeah. Yet. Actually, no, we have several. Never mind.
So actually, it's a good segue, because we were just talking kind of about that. But what, in your opinion, Sean, is the most important thing for the average person who's interested in headphones to understand, or to look to learn about? Like, say you're just getting into it, and you're like, what should I research?
Well, I mean, I think probably the most, if I'm a consumer and I'm purchasing, you have to figure out, how am I going to be using this? Where am I going to be using it? So that'll decide whether you want over ear, open, closed, whether you're traveling, and
use case is important.
use cases. So once you get that out of the way, then you have to figure out. I think fit. I mean, if it's a closed back headphone or an in-ear headphone, if you don't get a good fit, a good seal, you could be throwing away several octaves of music, below 500 hertz. And
right.
I've personally experienced this where one of the headphones we make, I could not get a good seal. It was an in-ear headphone until I went out and bought some Comply foam tips.
Right.
And so, in loudspeakers, bass is 30% of the preference. It's weighted 30% of the preference rating. So
yeah.
If you don't get a good seal, then you're throwing away a lot of the music. And I remember 10 years ago reading a review of an in-ear headphone. It was in Sound and Vision, and they had 4 or 5 reviewers reviewing the same headphone, and their opinion of the headphone was completely different, and it was all related to bass. It was clearly different levels of seal. So
right.
So that's I think the most important thing.
And as it relates to your research, and if somebody's just starting to learn about the Harman target and they haven't watched this, what would you say is maybe the key thing to start with, I suppose, with your research?
Well, there's a lot of there's starting to be a lot of material out there that explains the research. Try to find a good explanation, and most of them are pretty good.
Yeah, I've left a bunch of the papers in the description, so if anybody
I
think he means the summary articles.
Yeah.
And the papers may be too technical, but there's a lot of videos and PowerPoints out there that explain it. And I would recommend people seek out good measurements and start to look at headphones that have been measured and use that as a sort of a first means to filter out the good ones from the bad ones. And then as your list gets smaller, start if you can listen to them, that's always the best.
Right.
Yeah.
Good advice. I had some other more personal questions. If you had to pick a favorite headphone, over-ear headphone, I'm not sure if you could answer this, but what would it be?
Oh, I mean,
you can say the DCA Stealth if you want.
Yeah, no, I've heard the DCA Stealth, and it's a very good sounding headphone to me. I can't afford it, but
that was my conclusion.
Yeah. I can't afford it, he says, with his backdrop featuring speakers that I'll never be able to afford.
If I get the discount on the Stealth headphone, I can afford it.
I don't know if DCA is a Harman company. I don't know if that is.
No, not yet. I'm just kidding. So, my day-to-day headphones, these ones.
Is that the same as these ones? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow, now I feel left out.
Yeah. Well, but you're using the ones that were used in the study, so yeah.
So I like these, but they're only good if you're, at your computer with a sound card. When I go for walks or travel, I use not this particular one, but very similar. These in-ears.
Right.
And sometimes when I used to travel, which I haven't since COVID, I've been pretty well grounded here. I used to use the AKG N700s, which are a noise canceling headphone.
Yeah.
And these are just products that I've tested. I know are good and they're affordable. So I also have over there some very expensive headphones that we don't make, which I could equally recommend. Things are still hot in Vancouver.
Yeah, it's because I'm running these AKGs off of a tube amp probably, and it's no. I'm just...
Yeah.
Well, okay, that's good to know. I know we were gonna have Metal 571 join on the stream before, but he has to work unfortunately, and he was
I'm
wanted
the low rent replacement.
But he wanted to know, if what you would consider sort of the flagship headphone of AKG these days, or if there is one in mind.
Yeah, for in-ear, it would be the N5005, which is this, it's like $1,000.
Oh wow!
I don't know what they're currently selling for, but it's a hybrid design with balanced armatures, several balanced armatures, and a dynamic driver for the bass. So that was probably the first AKG in-ear headphone design to the Harman target. So it's and that's the one I had trouble keeping in my ears. I had to get the Comply foam tips to get a good seal.
Right.
So.
And for over ear, is it
for over ear?
I think he was asking about the K8 something. So I didn't.
Oh goodness!
But I think it might have been from an older headphone.
Yeah, well,
that's quite old, isn't it?
Yeah.
The 812 or the 8. There's a closed version of that which I personally don't like.
Right.
And it does not comply to the Harman target curve.
Right. Okay. I have there's lots of other questions, but before we get into the Q&A here, I want to just quickly pivot to non-headphone related stuff. You and I have talked a lot about wine and this kind of thing. And just as I suppose a point of comparison, what do you think predictive or the preference research entails within a larger context, like something like wine or other aesthetic things that people would experience? And I'm just wondering if something like a Harman target, if you think something like a Harman target, would be doable for other areas, right?
Yeah. Should there be a Harman target for wine?
Yeah, as an example, right? With a taste palette profile and all that kind of stuff.
Audio is often compared to wine. Even very academic researchers have gone to the science of wine literature, which there is a science involved in wine where they do very controlled not listening tests, but blind tastings, and they do profile analysis they figure out the attributes, and then they look at the chemical profile. And but it always comes down to this, where, and even within Harman, we've had marketing people who say that our speakers should be like wine and they shouldn't be. Yeah, seriously. That music, that speakers, flat neutral speakers that score high are bland and boring, and they should be like wine and have nuances and body and this and that. And I always come back to, well, wine is there's no reference, right? With music and audio, we have references. We can put a singer in a listening room. We can listen to her live. We can record her and reproduce her through the speaker. And there's some reference. We have real live sound sources we can compare, and we can measure the device and see how, if it deviates from linearity. With wine, there's no such thing. It's a man-made thing. It's a piece of art. So wine is the art, and music is the art. And I always say that the loudspeaker is the wine glass. It should be transparent and impart no character or color to the music. So that's our philosophy.
So if the wine is shit, it's not because of the glass.
Yeah, and I've recently gotten into some arguments because I found some research that showed that the wine glass doesn't really have much of a factor on the taste or flavor of the wine. That it's all BS. So I think wine glasses are like high-end cables.
Well, one of the things, having worked in the wine industry in Canada, believe it or not, for years, one of the things I did come across was whenever you're going out wine tasting, there various different wineries will have ways of washing the wine glasses, and they can be different. And sometimes you can actually get whatever the soap that they use that can actually affect the wine glass. It can be a little bit residual, and absolutely that has a fairly negative influence on it. But yeah, I think apart from that, it's I remember you posted a study about like I think folks were using eyedroppers or something in blind tests with wine, which is
there's been a lot of research showing that these wine experts they follow their tastings over several different tastings, and the repeatability of their ratings is like it's like random.
Right.
So so it's a bit like, I think, audio reviewers who if you put them in a room and do double blind tests, they we did a study where we showed their reliability, and it's not very good, much worse than a trained listener. So and then I posted something recently where they put people in MRI machines and looked at their brains, and while they're tasting wine, or they would just basically tell them the price of it, and the pleasure zones would light up, and the just suggesting that this is expensive wine, or you put it in a fancy bottle, you can easily fool people. So their perception is highly influenced by cognitive factors unrelated to the taste.
Right. I love this.
We call that the Veblen effect.
What's that?
In economics, that's called the Veblen effect, that people basically want things more when they're more expensive, or, well, non-linear. Anyway. I did actually want to ask you, though, about the reviewers scoring poorly result. Now, obviously, hilarious result. I like it. I like quoting it. But some folks have been maybe extrapolating pretty hard from that one. So is there another study other than the one where there was just 6 reviewers, or is it mostly just those particular 6 guys were worse than untrained?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, you'll probably never get a reviewer willing to participate in that study anymore. But I think... I don't know. I mean, I think the biggest problem with reviewers is Stereophile is a good example, where they send the speakers out to these guys, and they in their own room. So it's a very uncontrolled situation. They set them up. They may or may not measure them to see if they're, calibrated with the room, and we often find completely random correlations between their reviews and our blind controlled listening tests. And then they do measurements. John Atkinson will do measurements, and the measurements don't seem to correlate at all with what the reviewer says. And the editor gets very defensive that you shouldn't just rely on the measurements. There's things that the reviewer is hearing that may not be there. But I just see this as an uncontrolled listening situation that's producing random results, and they're using and the measurements basically don't back up what they're saying. And to me, that's a red flag. I mean, that's just an uncontrolled listening test, which can lead to misleading conclusions. And I think it's a disservice to the industry when those things are controlled. So I always rely on measurements in those situations over what a reviewer says.
Oh yeah,
should have Metal 571 Clinical Android and myself in one of those. Be fun to do.
So you're aiming to beat the low correlation score.
Yeah, or just see if we can. I'd be curious, actually. There's the only thing that I participated in that was kind of like that was when Dunu reached out to a number of reviewers and had us do Dunu, the IEM manufacturer, and they had us do fill out sort of like a before measurements assessment of the sound quality, and we couldn't talk to one another. We couldn't bounce ideas off of each other or whatever. And then we were supposed to then do another test after we'd done the measurements to see kind of, if it. I don't think it was intended to just be about whether or not it lined up, but because I think the intention was more to see, irrespective of measurements, did people actually enjoy this or think it was better? And I think what they found, I didn't look at the specific results, but they did find that in like 16 out of 20 categories, the reviewers that they had chosen all found that the IEMs that were being compared, to the in-ear headphones that were being compared, were preferable, right? The newer ones were preferable than the older ones, or something like that. So I like stuff like that, where it's like you kind of go in blind and you're not basing your judgments on the narratives that have sort of emerged maybe as a result of one, factor or another. You read some comment online that says, oh, this headphone has no whatever, or it's good at this, then that's going to have an influence on, the things that you're trying to assess. So, but yeah, very interesting. So I think we could probably get into the Q&A session right now. Guys on the stream who are with us here, now is the time to put or write your questions in the chat for anybody who has questions, and we'll try and get answer as many as we can. We'll probably go for another like 15 minutes, if that works. But in the meantime, Blaine, is there anything else that you'd like to ask Sean about? Or
yes,
there's more
actually,
I can do as well.
This one is completely unrelated to headphones, but because obviously you have some history in speaker research. Something that I've long wondered is, we're pretty clear on what the target, steady state / power response of a speaker should be, right? Mm-hmm. But something that I've been increasingly interested in, and admittedly I haven't read the speaker lit as deeply as I have the headphone lit, is what about something that isn't on axis flat in an anechoic chamber, but has perhaps a wider directivity, but still the same downward slanting power response that people prefer? Something kind of like Mirage speakers used to do that, the omnidirectional ones.
Yeah, I know that speaker. Floyd Toole used to have a pair in his living room, and that was a speaker that was it was a dipole, so it had drivers on both the front and the back. So it was almost omnidirectional, even though they called it a dipole or a bipole. So that would produce a very strong rear reflection off the wall, and the image would be completely diffuse, very wide, and until you put some curtains or some absorption behind it, it was, for a lot of people, just too diffuse. But that speaker did have a slight downward tilt in the on-axis response, and some of the reasons were that it has it's so omnidirectional up to a fairly high frequency that the overall sound power is too bright. So they would try to compensate for by tilting it a bit. So, I mean, I think there's a good case where you need to do listening. If you design that, because the directivity is so unusual, you would have to do some listening to try to fine tune it until it sounds balanced. But again, that speaker very dependent on the room because its directivity is so low. Floyd had it set up this was back in Canada, so he had it set up in a very large living room, and they were far away, and it almost sounded like you were in a concert hall when you put on a symphonic piece of music.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we do have some questions coming in now, and some fun comments.
Yes, request for a cage match.
Yeah. First question I see from DMS. That's DMS, the reviewer. Good to see DMS there. I think he's been with us the whole time. He says, super curious how Sean feels about things that meet the standard for 711 rigs, but from China. So, for example, I think actually it's one of the rigs that he's using. So that's I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it's essentially a knockoff Gross 43AG, something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's much more
with the stiffer pinna.
With the stiffer pinna, yeah, exactly. And so he's curious if what your thoughts are on that, or if you've come across that. He says it's better than the mini DSP ears, which I can verify it is, but still questionable, because I think in order to achieve the like some symmetry with the industry standard rigs, you got to use a compensation, I believe. But it's the main point is that it's a much more attainable piece of equipment for reviewers because it's under $1,000. So I guess that's What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't have any personal experience with this. It's made by Sound or
no, I don't think it's the Sound fixture.
Oh,
at least they weren't selling it when I talked to them. I don't know if they're the ones who make it now.
Taobao or AliExpress or one of those.
Okay, So I mean, I'm not familiar with it, but I mean, if it meets the spec, I can't see what the issue is. Just like there's many different kinds of microphones, you can buy a B&K, a Grass,
right?
And if it meets a spec, and then it comes down to reliability and how robust it is and how sensitive it is to temperature and humidity and those sorts of things. But I don't see an issue. The fact that the pin is not as stiff, or it's stiffer, it could be an issue. In terms of leakage and
the next question here is what Blaine's laughing at something.
I'm laughing at the next question.
Oh no, I was going to ask about what your thoughts are on the Etymotic research and their targets, or I guess their IEMs.
Oh, I mean, I have a long history with Etymotic by going back to NRC. When we did some binaural recordings, they made a headphone. I forget what the model was, but it had the tubes and the yellow foam things, and then the amplifiers, and they were the most accurate headphone you could buy at the time for doing binaural recording reproduction. So Floyd and I had a long relationship with them, and Meade Killian, who's the principal of that company. So there's a lot of respect on my part. So where we kind of part ways, I guess, is they have a target based on that's slightly different, and it's flat in the bass.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing is that Meade has this model he uses to calculate accuracy scores, and it's based on a similar model that was developed at Consumer Reports, where they measure the accuracy of loudspeakers on it. And I did a study that basically totally proved that it was, we had negative correlation with Consumer Reports ratings and preference ratings.
Right, I remember that, yeah.
So, but that's, loudspeakers and headphones are not really the same. I think, so there's this issue of the bass. And a few years ago, Meade gave me some headphones and some recordings, and he was basically doing a study to show whether bass was, whether they needed more bass. And I never saw the results of that study. I just gave him some data based on our listeners. And shortly after, they came out with a statement that's saying that, well, we need more. It's not the bass that's the problem, it's the treble. And all recordings are made with speakers that tend to have reduced treble. Now, the reduced treble, if you look at the sound power response, because most speakers are flat on axis, and then the sound power is falling. So I don't understand, if he expects the sound power should be flat, but nonetheless, they changed the treble of their headphones. So their target curve dropped in treble, which may compensate for the lack of bass. And then I guess more recent models, they start to add bass as well. So
yeah.
So anyways,
series, I think.
Yeah. So I personally own Etymotic headphones many years. I would travel with them, and I was always turning up the bass on my iPod because I just found them very thin. And We've included them in our listening test when we did this study, and you know, apart from the thinness, they're very good, but people would score them lower because of the thinness.
Right. Fair enough.
But apart from the bass, you know, they're excellent headphones.
Yeah. Someone's asking what causes grain in headphones. I think this is potentially in reference to some of the reviews that Metal 571's done, where he's talking about grain.
So maybe he should answer that question.
Yeah, well, I don't want to answer for Sean here, but I think that, I mean, in a lot of cases, you can find that in frequency response. You can find, you know, various different features and peaks and things like that.
Yeah. If it has a lot of series of resonances, that could possibly be a factor. I'd have to confirm what it is.
Yeah.
What grain is.
Exactly.
I've been trying to confirm that for 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the common definitions are sort of like you hear it as like the absence of detail, but at this point where we're now talking about whether or not something sounds expensive, I don't think that doesn't really help us get anywhere. Someone's asking why Dr. Olive hasn't updated his profile picture in decades.
That picture is, I think, 20 years old, and you're using it on this.
Yes, we couldn't find another one.
So I don't know.
I'll be honest, I think you look better on stream.
Yes, we've used that actually in a few at least 2 thumbnails now.
Yeah.
Yes, the one it was Godzilla.
Yeah, that was my favorite.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Another question here. I have a question that doesn't really relate to headphones, but we'll get to some more here. But how well do you think the Habs are going to do in 2021, 2022?
Well, someone knows I'm a Habs fan.
Well,
or is that your question?
That's my question.
Oh, okay.
Because I know.
Yeah, well, their opening game is tonight, so
yeah,
we'll find out. But I mean, I'm a little concerned. They've lost Shea Weber. They've Carey Price is out indefinitely, and there's a lot of they've lost Philip Deneau, who shut down basically all the top scorers. So there's a lot of changes that most people, I think, don't think they'll do as well this year, but we'll see.
So someone on Twitter was saying that the stream is probably just going to be us talking about Canadian wine and hockey. So I figured I had to at least put that in there.
Yeah. Are you a hockey fan, Andrew?
Oh yeah, I'm a Canucks fan. So I suppose I was going to ask, who's going to do better, the Habs or the Canucks? Well, that's the thing, is that I don't. After years of disappointment, I don't really have any expectations for the Canucks anymore.
So are they going to do better than the Seattle Kraken, do you think?
I think yes.
Hey,
I think yes, and that's Blaine's neck of the woods.
Oh, Blaine's from
He's in Seattle, or near Seattle, yeah.
Yeah, the Kraken lost their opening game last night to Vegas, but it was pretty. It was tighter than I thought.
Yeah.
We're gonna fucking suck.
Yeah. I have that feeling as well. There's more questions here, so we'll get a few more of these in. But someone's asking about where they could see all the preference ratings, but I imagine for various different headphones. But what I'm wondering is would you ever consider having like a database of preference rating scores for various different results? Or is this something that is not within the wheelhouse of what you're doing?
Well, I mean, I've published online in most cases predicted ratings of our headphones. So I've done that. There's databases out there where people are measuring these things and using our model and showing the scores. So that information exists online as long as you can trust the measurements.
Right.
In some cases they're good, some cases they're not.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough. I see
There's
another.
a few people who've asked about Soundstage and Headphones, which actually might be an interesting one to ask because we haven't talked about that.
Very good question. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, what is your thoughts on generally the concept of subjective soundstage in headphones as opposed to in speakers.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I personally don't get sound staging in headphones. Everything is inside my head. And the differences that I hear between headphones, I mean, there's, to me, it's not a huge attribute, because the differences I hear between different headphones are so small that, but I can understand with some people that's important. In my view, the next phase of audio will be spatialization of stereo or multi-channel or object-based audio that includes, maybe a personalization based on your HRTFs and with head tracking. And I think when we get to that level, then I think staging will be hugely important. You'll be able to measure the localization accuracy. We're already doing some research where we listen to binaural renderings of signals, and we have a laser pointer, and you can point exactly where you think it is, and we can compare that listening to your own HRTF versus some generic HRTF. So then, yeah, but right now with stereo through headphones, to me, everything is spatially deprived, and it's just not valuable to me right now.
So I think someone was asking that question in reference to a comparison between the Sennheiser HD800, the headphones Blaine's wearing there, and the M50X,
I think Dr. Olive knows what the HD800 is.
Yeah,
yeah,
and whether you could theoretically EQ an M50X or an M50, I'm not sure, but to sound like an HD800, which is a headphone that within the audiophile circles, it's renowned for having a spacious in-head localization, or all that stuff.
A spacious in-head localization. That sounds like
yeah.
oxymoron.
Yeah,
It's because it makes your head hollow.
Yes. And some people have theorized that this quality comes from a specific frequency response cut in it's like around 1.5 kilohertz, somewhere around there,
mm-hmm.
that enhances it. It's sort of like, I don't know if artificially is the right word, but it enhances the sense of soundstage. And that if you'd be able to do that with the M50.
It's funny because I've heard on an ASR that having more information at 1 to 2K makes things sound more spacious. Have you heard that?
More information there. That's interesting.
That's a take I've never heard before. I'll be honest.
Okay, maybe I misread it, but
there's a lot of takes on ASR.
Yeah.
I don't know. I contribute some of the bad ones.
Yeah, I have heard that 800s are very spacious. Generally people will say open back headphones are more spacious, and for a lot of people, that's the reason they choose them. To me, it's just, this is a personal thing, right? I haven't done any research specifically in that area, and I've heard recently with the Stealth, people describe it as the most open back closed headphone they've heard.
That was me. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You're a
but
forget it. I said it.
But it's funny that you mentioned to bring that up, because that was my very first sort of listening impression. I think one of the things that made it stand out is that I think because of that AMTS, the tuning filter that they put in front, it didn't have some of the resonances that I would typically associate with closed back headphones, or some of the issues that would be in frequency response, or that would be found in frequency response. So to me, that's one of the things that made it sound a little bit more like an open back headphone, I guess.
Yeah.
But
so that suggests that you may be able to achieve the effect of an open back headphone with the proper linearity. And the other thing is, I wonder to what extent it's a cognitive thing where you have something closed on your head and it's closed and there's some pressure that you just can't imagine that things are outside your head when you can physically feel your ears being closed off.
I know Oratory, Constantine, from USound, can I say that? But Oratory 1990 has talked a lot about. I didn't say his last name.
Okay.
But Oratory has specifically said that he thinks that contact with the pinna is like a major thing that makes the HG800 perceived as more airy.
I was going to say
it has space.
The other aspect is, and Blaine's mentioned this to me, when you're listening to an open back headphone, you can actually hear other things. You can hear the room, sort of, like, depending on where you are, and that may have some psychoacoustic effect. That
I find it gives some illusion that, sound is coming from real space instead of just the room inside my dome. But
so if that's true, if you listen to your closed back headphones with ambient aware on, will it sound more like an open back headphone?
Subjectively, I would say that it feels less congested. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know of any research on that, but
yeah. So the Apple AirPod Max should sound like an open back headphone because it has a very good transparency mode. But
I've never heard that one, so
I hate
no.
that headphone. Like, it's terrible. It's funny because actually Jude and I were talking about it at Can Jam, and he likes that.
Jude said it's the highest rated headphone based on this head acoustics. Yeah.
So I mean, it's interesting to hear that, and just some of the differences, because it's funny because we at the office we have a whole bunch of the AirPods Max, and everybody's listened to them, and everybody in our office doesn't like them. So
what is it they don't like about them? Is it
I think
tonal
it's more,
balance?
Yeah, I think it's tonal balance. Well, at least for me, it's tonal balance related. It's more like the lack of ear gain coupled with the slight boost before, like maybe at around 1.5K. I'll have to double check what the actual frequency response is there. But to me, it's the combination of those two things where the whole thing sounds a little bit congested because it doesn't have the full clarity there. Not the 5K stuff, because there's that question, which I think it'd be interesting to see if there's some unique coupling thing that causes it to measure differently on an actual human head versus a test fixture. But
doctors, I think they're both doctors, Dorte Hammershøi and
Hammershøi and Mahler. You could just say Hammershøi and Mahler.
Yeah, from Denmark. They had some research on the effects of coupling and front volume impedance on like variability between people in the 90s. I think they called it free air equivalent coupling.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that you're saying that could be responsible for some of these differences. I mean, and this is something that for me has been a bit of a, I don't know what I would describe it as, but something I keep coming back to, and it's something that Tyle mentioned a long time ago, which was that in theory, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but it was something along the lines of, in theory, the differences in impressions aren't necessarily down to a difference in measurement at the eardrum, because we've all been living our whole lives with the various different gain factors that our ears are imparting anyways, and so we should be used to that by now. But then at the same time, when I encounter things like this, so my thinking there was it's probably down to the coupling being a stronger variable there for why people experience things differently or have different reports. But then I come across some situations where people say, I hear this very strong peak at this one particular place, or this strong resonance, and I think I don't know how I could explain that with just the coupling, but maybe it is. So actually, and maybe that question for you is, what do you think is the strongest variable for why people report different things? I mean, I know in some of the research you covered, listener age and gender and trained versus untrained. But do you think that there's anything to the idea that a difference in physical ear shape can have an influence on this?
Well, insofar as the ear shape will maybe affect the fit, for sure. That's one factor. The coupling. Well, yeah, if you have big ears that stick out from your head, on certain headphones, you're not going to get a good fit or seal.
Right.
So that'll affect the bass. And then how it interacts with your pinna can certainly be responsible for some spatial cues that could but that's at mostly higher frequencies. Yeah, I mean, and some of it's just as you said, age, and and the other big variable out there is the ear canal, right?
Oh yeah, that's the biggest one.
The volume of the ear canal and the shape can affect the resonance, the frequency of the resonance of the ear canal, and also how large and what the cue is. So some people will argue that is a huge variable that needs to be accounted for when you design or personalize a headphone.
Right.
But there's not a lot of data to tell us, what to do.
And
Right.
there is some data that directly opposes that. I
idea.
know.
Yeah. There's some data that says, once things are in the ear canal, it doesn't really matter. There's no directional information.
Yeah.
Um,
So interesting.
just because we've been kind of ignoring the question. I'm so sorry about that, by the way. That's my fault. But a couple of people have asked what you think the ideal price point is, or like the sweet spot for price value is, based on your research. It's in reference to your paper on the lack of correlation between price and sound quality.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be, well, I mean, that's a hard question to answer because there's this sweet spot in the market where, I don't know, it's like $200 to $300. And so there's a lot of headphones in that category. And then outside of that category, there's fewer and fewer. So, I would, when we did this research 3 or 4 years ago, I would say you're really taking your risks if you go outside that, $500 range, because there's a lot of good headphones that perform as well or better than a lot of these expensive ones. But we didn't test a lot of expensive headphones. So I think if we were to redo that, things like the Stealth and I think there's probably better headphones that are expensive now than there were, say, 5 years ago. And I'd have to think our research has in part helped that. So unless people are completely in the dark ages and don't have an internet connection, or they don't read papers, they surely would have to take heed with the research, or at least consider it. And they've probably learned how to measure headphones. I think more and more companies now are measuring headphones than ever before. Right. So there's really no excuse to make a $2,000 headphone and not have it measure well and sound good. So
that relates to a question that I see from one of our forum members, actually, Senior C, and he's actually a reviewer on our forum as well. He's asking, what does Dr. Olive think about people only following measurements without actually listening to said headphones? So I think it would be saying this, headphone A is better than headphone B without having heard them, but purely based on the measurements. And I have sort of a related addition to that. Do you think that we should, those of us who are doing the measurements, do you think that we should listen first and then do the measurement and make sure that it agrees? Or do you think that you can just do the measurement and then just say, here's the data?
Yeah, I mean, I've had, over the course of my career, we do a lot of listening tests. So I never usually want to see the measurements before I do a test. I'm very biased by measurements. And if I see something that's horrible, I'll know what to listen for, and I'm not usually fooled. If I can see a measurement of a speaker and it measures a certain way, I'll go into the test with an expectation that it's going to sound like this. So, so I always get someone else to measure it just to make sure it's not broken.
Right.
Because we don't want to run 20 listeners through a test with a product that's broken. So verify that it's not broken, and then do the test, and then measure it afterwards. That's generally my philosophy. And as far as just relying totally on measurements, I don't think that's a good idea either. I think you should, because the measurements, will not confirm everything about it. So certainly the distortion, there may be a buzz or a rattle that's not showing up in the measurement. And so, yeah.
Maybe in situ coupling differences or something may also.
Yeah. And if it has a weird coupling, then you probably want to get several people to listen to it, because and maybe that can be identified in your measurements. Does it, in terms of repeatability, ideally you should have several different mannequins and different head sizes I think that needs to be done. Right now we're measuring things on a median head, and it may not apply to a person with unique ears or larger or smaller heads. And so, relying on the opinion of one person without measurements is, to me, a red flag. At least there should be measurements to back it up. And if you have more than one reviewer or more than one listener, I think that's ideal.
This is I've been saying similar things for a while, that we often get too siloed in terms of where our information, where information sources are, and that ends up being one community gets pitted against another, and so on and so forth, when really it should be more about seeing well, I shouldn't say it's like that all the time, because there are a number of other reviewers who will have similar findings to what I do, which is good for me, because it confirms that this unit's not broken, or this unit is representative. So I'm thinking of Clinical, for example. So that's good to hear as well, echoed.
Yeah.
Anything else you see there, Blaine? I think we should do maybe like one or two more, and then
there's two short ones and then one long one that might be good. One short one is just what you're using to drive your Revels, which apparently is multiple people asked over the course of this.
Well, I have Mark Levinson amplifiers. So they're two, 536s. So they're monoblock amps. They're 400 watts into 8 ohms, 800 watts into 4 ohms. And then I have a Mark Levinson, it's a number 519, which is it's like a preamp. Mostly has digital sources, some analog inputs as well, but and it has built into it Rune and Tidal, and so
cool.
I can stream music right into it. And you can also hook up a hard drive server, but yeah, that's basically it. And I have Rune, so I can send music to it, and yeah. It was a Christmas, Easter, and Halloween gift a few years ago to myself.
Out of curiosity, I mean, do you have like a genre preference, or what kind of music do you normally gravitate towards personally?
Well, we know Jennifer Warren's places.
I was going to say, ask if Kanye West is on that list.
No, I'm a classically trained musician, so I did a music degree. I play piano, so classical music, jazz. I love jazz, but I listen to pop music, and the only thing I don't listen to is country. Not so much rap. To me, they're just test signals. I would never listen to them.
Well, this is what I liked about when you're saying we have reference points in real life for a piano and things like that,
Yeah.
and like vocals, right? Like for me, that's the big thing. If I'm just listening to electronic music, I don't have that reference point. I mean, it depends on what it is, of course, but I much prefer, again, for me, it's jazz is a big thing for me, and it's because I have those reference points in real life.
Yeah, and a lot of jazz is, you have reference points, and a lot of it's acoustic. So
you get all the overtones. Yeah.
And generally the goal in the recording is to, represent the music as naturally as possible. So
Yeah.
it makes it easier.
Definitely. Sorry, Blaine, what was that other? We missed
The
one.
second, the second short one was from Julian Krauss, and it was whether you're planning on doing testing on the new Head Acoustics high resolution head in addition to the 5128. It's their version of the 5128.
Shout out to Julian Krause, by the way. He's got a
Yeah, I mean, we would, yeah, I mean, we don't have one in our lab, so we'd have to get one. But if one became available, I would certainly consider testing it. Yeah.
The larger one was, I'm just rereading this to make sure I had this right. How large are the margins in the headphone model's predictions before it will be hard to guess the actual listener-based preference score? That is, how certain is the difference between a score of 80 and a score of 85?
Yeah, I think in the model, the root mean square error is around, I don't know, six or 7 points I can't remember exact number, but on a 100-point scale, it's within a margin of error of, half, 5 or 6 points. So yeah, there's some limits to how accurate it is. And my recollection, though, it was almost the same as the subjective error. So any of these predictive models are always limited by the resolution of your subjective data, and that's the limiting factor usually.
Okay. I think there's lots more questions that we could go through, but I think we've taken up
we've kept
quite a bit of Dr. Olaf's
Wow,
time.
2.5 hours.
Yeah. So actually, I want to just sort of end the stream by turning the floor over to you and Sean, and if there's anything that you want to just say in general, or what you're working on, or any of that stuff, the floor is yours, basically. Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm happy to. We talked about doing this, I don't know, a couple of years ago maybe, and finally happy to do it. It's nice to meet you, Blaine.
That's an honor, sir.
Yeah, and so not much to say. I mean, most of our research right now is focused on spatial audio. So, but I think in the realm of headphones, that's going to be a big, important, taking development. And I see with Atmos music now, and more signals or music being streamed with multi-channel, that the possibilities of spatializing that over headphones is probably going to be the next big development, I think. And there's lots of reasons to be optimistic and excited about what's to come.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's well put. So yeah, I wanted to, I guess, thank both Sean and Blaine for doing this. It's been a great pleasure to have you on, and also thanks to all the folks in the chat for your questions. And I just got to say, on a personal note, it's been an absolute joy to read the research, and I'm sad that the new stuff won't be public. But there's lots more for me to still keep reading, because I think that's the big thing for me, has been all the learning, right? And so I'm looking forward to doing more of that. But yeah, anybody else who hasn't done that yet, I highly recommend or encourage you guys to read through some of the Harman research if you can. But otherwise, we'll definitely be doing more videos on that in the future. But that's going to do it for this live stream. So once again, thanks to both of you guys, and we'll see everybody in the next one.